Welcome back to the Magic the Gathering Unofficial Audiobooks podcast. I know you're probably binging these things as they first come out because I'm releasing them all together. So just a quick shout out to our first sponsor of the show and asking for you to check out the Etsy shop, etsy.com/shop/apes-in-capes, customizable Shadowbox cubes. There's a link in the show notes. Go browse. I guarantee you will not be disappointed. Plus, if you order, you can get 10% off your order by using the code word MAGIC at checkout. These things are perfect additions to your collection and are truly great pieces of handmade work. A reminder, the next 5 patrons who join up to the Patreon for the show and cross $100 will receive a special edition Shadowbox Cube, Urza and Mishra battling it out at Friday Night Magic. You gotta see it to believe it. So again, etsy.com/shop/apes-in-capes, 10% off with the code MAGIC at checkout, and support the show on Patreon to help support my daughter meeting her grandparents for the first time. I'm grateful you are here. Enjoy. Chapter 4. Leaving the kingdom of Zolfir in its wake, hardly a dark smudge set against the graying coastline, the Weatherlight's crew checked all horizons and called them clear. Karn glanced back towards the ship's stern. Color for sunset framed the aft end of the ship. Ilsa Bravin, the vessel's current captain, commanded from the quarterdeck. She bellowed commands which would not be heard again on the Weatherlight for some time. "Rig the ship for sky! Take her up!" Crewmen shifted the sail rigging, and engineers brought the ship's magical engines up to power. Slowly, the sleek vessel rose from the embrace of blue-gray waters and into a sky-washed pale red by the dying sun. The skyship's sharp bowsprit whistled as it cleaved the air. The sails remained full billowed by magical energies which wrapped themselves about the skyborne vessel. Most of the sailors and students aboard would agree that this was one of the best moments, when the freedom the Weatherlight offered was palpable, especially to those who rode on the open deck. Karn did not revel in that moment, though this would be the final flight to the Weatherlight before security issues forced it to remain in the role of a simple ocean-bound vessel. He remembered other times well enough when he had enjoyed his time on the ship, pleasant moments on the deck or down in the heart of the vessel where the Silver Golem could physically link with the Weatherlight's Power Stone engine and command the ship's flight with a level of precision no human's crew could hope to match. Those were heady times in the Golem's life, good times indeed, now lost. Over the last 10 years, Tolaria had begun to feel like a prison to Karn. His constant movement between the different temporal zones made him uneasy, unable to really know any of the students anymore. They were lost in a mayfly life while the Silver Man stepped into slow time to assist Rain, Baron, and Gatha. Against his better judgment, Karn remained Gatha's friend, the tutor's only friend, it seemed. Other academy staff avoided him. Many of the students who worked under the tutor were afraid of him. Gatha did not seem to mind the lack of human contact, content in his work and a periodic acquaintance with Karn. That Karn needed something more came to a head when, during one of those visits to Slow Time, the Golem missed one of Joyra's rare appearances on Tolaria. The Silver Golem did not hold resentment for Gatha's summons, but it did cast him into a personal depression which only Baron and Rain had noticed and finally worked him through with a few kind words and gestures. It was Gatha's continued use of the Phyrexian material and the Bloodlines that finally convinced Karn to seek a leave of absence from Tolaria. So many of his subjects were born malformed, and nearly all of them so far turned malevolent to some degree as they matured relatively quickly in fast-time environments. The Golem had found himself unable to reconcile his friendship with Gatha and the revulsion he felt toward the man's practices. Karn remembered the years of fighting against the small Phyrexian community that had once infested Tolaria. He remembered the terrible creatures that repeatedly rose in newer, more hideous forms and the many good lives lost because of them. He easily recalled their grotesque features, artifice and flesh intermingled, and the caustic scent of the slime and the oil that they called blood. He could still hear the screeching cacophony of noise that was their speech and screams. Worst of all, he remembered his own empathy for the black nightmares, that tiny spark within him which recognized Phyrexians as kindred. Karn knew of the black power stone which gave him true life, Xancha's heart. It had been first tied to the life of Urza's former companion, a Phyrexian newt who turned against her old masters and old world, had retained its powers after she gave her life to defeat the Phyrexian Gix, and so Urza had bound it to the Golem and brought about his first sentient artifact. The Power Stone responded to Phyrexian still. principle of similarity, Baron had called it, trying to relieve Karn's anxiety with an explanation. Like must recognize like, but Karn had felt that same spark of empathy for Gatha's creations, and it frightened him. He did not want such feelings confusing his true friendships with good people like Joyra, Baron, and Rain. Upon hearing that Rain and the forest spirit Multani would lead an embassy to Yawgmoth on the Weatherlight's next tour, its final flight, Karn volunteered to help crew the vessel in hopes of reliving a few of those better days and so reclaim some hold on the present. Except that hadn't worked. Karn heard the Weatherlights call to him even now, that deep hum of power that bled up through the polished wooden deck, a sound so bass it was felt more than heard. It was different this time. Missing were the other people who had made those times alive for the Silver Golem, mostly Teferi and Joyra. All was back to Joyra, for whom, Karn admitted now, he had made this entire trip. He wanted to talk to his first and best friend, but neither she nor Teferi had been in Zolfir, the ship's first port of call, and no one had been able to say where they might have gone off to, or whether alone or together. There would be no absolution on this journey, only the hard, cruel truth the golem now faced standing alone on the ship's deck. He had tried to run away, but his past would never allow that. It followed him, tormenting, tireless. Right then, Karn wished it all away. Never once did he consider what such a wish might cost him. Multani moved to the edge of the quarterdeck, away from the tight knot of Academy observers whom Captain Bravin had invited up into her domain for landing. The nature spirit gripped the rail. He could feel life in the ship, a life which was still as much part of Yawgmoth as a being of its own essence, much like himself. Even from a distance, Multani would fail to pass for a human or one of the more humanoid races. His trunk, exactly that, a medium-sized bowl too thick and cylindrical to remind one of a body. His arms and legs were thick branches, very knobby at the joints, and his fingers and toes root-like extremities. Bark-like skin covered the backs of his hands, forearms, and the top of his feet, and his face seemed to sprout from the top of his trunk. Hair, the color and texture of spring moss, fell back from his scalp and upper shoulders, the mane tumbling halfway down his back. He had chlorophyll eyes, green irises staining veins into the white, and a leaf-shaped pattern tattooing the left side of his wood-grain face. He was created from the essence of Yawgmoth, the sentient forest packaged in humanoid form. Now, after better than a century away, he was leading a Tolarian embassy and Llanowar ambassador back to his homeland. Blue-green waters rolled up to a thin outer arc of beaches which alternated between light yellow to reddish browns and the intermittent green of coastal growth. The beach territory quickly faded toward pale washes of rainbow color as the weatherlight moved inland. That was new. The forest green had once stretched from one side to the island to another before Yawgmoth had begun some changes. The interior remained a dense canopy of greens, interrupted only by a few dark mountain peaks. The canopy rippled in places as if by an intense wind that no one else could feel. He felt the forest's anticipation and just a trace of concern for allowing so many outsiders access to its lands. The nature spirit sent back a soothing call. "It's wondrous," Raphaelos said, the Llanowar elf bounding up the rail beside him. The young warrior's dark, unruly hair fell in a tangled cascade down his back. He leapt up onto the narrow rail, leaning far over with one arm looped casually through nearby rigging. The bottom hem of his leather tunic waved in the moderate breeze created by the ship's passing. His sword dangled from a rough leather belt, an item he never set aside no matter the company or situation. Multani had moved aside to avoid the others, especially Rain, with whom he had already spent so much of this voyage in conference. But Raphaelos, for all of his energy and rough ways, was welcome. He was one of Gaia's forest-born, though more violent than most, then the same could be said of most Llanowar elves. That was the reason Yawgmoth had asked the Llanowar warrior clans to send an ambassador. Perhaps the Llanowar might learn from Yawgmoth something more of harmonious living. Respectful, as always, to Multani's slightest comment or movement, Raphaelos jumped back down to the deck. "I'm sorry, Multani. Didn't mean to disturb you." So close to home, Multani doubted that much could truly disturb him. Soon, he promised himself, he would know the forest's soothing touch again.
"Do not worry, Raphaelos. Yawgmoth welcomes you."
Raphaelos drew himself up proudly at the recognition, whether from Yawgmoth or Multani himself, the nature spirit couldn't be sure. In reality, it didn't matter. Perhaps Raphaelos could not fully appreciate the unique creation which was Yawgmoth yet, but certainly he stood in slight awe of the nature spirit. Multani watched the elf carefully as, still racing the wind at a good clip, the weatherlight flew over the island perimeter. The elf stared only slightly. "No beaches?" he grinned, obviously enthralled by the prospect. "No sand or rocks?" he said in wonder. "Only Yawgmoth."
You will find no sand.
Multani promised.
None safe.
Below them, the beaches had been consumed by a tangle of thick, thorny rootwork. The roots extended out from the small copses of coastal growth and curled and bunched as they ran across the open space and finally dived into the ocean shallows. A few last tips stuck out like huge spikes, as if to impale landing ships. When Rafellos mentioned this, the nature spirit nodded.
They are meant to do just that. You see years of patient growth at work here. Though Yawgmoth's defenses will tend to spread from the heart outward, an initial perimeter guard was deemed of great importance.
The elf forced on himself a moment to consider this, a sign of extreme patience in a land of war. Finally, he asked, "Does Yawgmoth tell you this?"
I simply know it to be true. Yawgmoth speaks through me. It has no need of speaking to me.
As the coastal route network and isolated copses fell away, the weatherlight crossed over what had appeared at first to be a painted desert. The air chilled and quickly turned to an intense cold. The nearby humans chattered excitedly, and Rafellos continued to stare over the side, oblivious to the temperature. Multani shivered in his physical shell, turning his face upward to stretch toward the sun's warming rays. "All roots, thinner ones, blanketing the ground." The elf fell silent for a few seconds. "Withering over... Are those dunes?"
Trees.
Multani whispered without looking.
The boles of ancient trees, centuries old, which Yawgmoth shaped and then recently fell here in perfect order so that no gap remains. The ground here reflects no heat. The warmth is pulled into the decomposing trees so that the root desert may grow faster.
The spirit looked ahead at the high cliff of wood that barred their path.
Captain Bravin, you may rise above those trees, but slow your speed. Your landing area is near.
The captain barked out the appropriate orders. "Not traveling into the heart of Yawgmoth?" Rafellos asked. Multani tensed at Rafellos' choice of words. He obviously knew nothing of what he asked, merely reflecting some of Multani's earlier statement. The true heart of Yawgmoth would never be known to the Llanowar. Likely it would never be known by Multani, so protected it was by the sentient forest. Though it was forbidden even to him, Multani knew a slightly jealous protection of his homelands.
For our purposes,
He said simply,
the borderlands will be close enough.
The vessel settled down in a clearing of dark grasses dotted with small, lavender-cup flowers. The field rippled under the same unfelt breeze that had earlier shaken treetops in the distance. Trees which reached hundreds of feet into the air surrounded them, visibly impressing many of the students. Multani recognized it as new growth raised in the last few years. Several of the larger hills around would be partially decomposed trees from the ancient growth, brought down by Yawgmoth for the raw material. The Tolarians went about their routine of making the vessel fast. Sails were reefed and the telescoping circular gangplank hauled out and dropped down over the side. Multani winced at the harsh clanging sounds as the staircase unfolded. He moved toward it once secured, but Rafellos ignored it completely. With a wild shout for his own bravery, the elf vaulted over the lower gunwale and slid down the outer curve of the hull. At the last moment, he kicked outward, breaking his fall with an easy tumble across the grass. He rose, only to one knee, though, suddenly transfixed by the rippling motion of the sward. Multani could only guess at the other's sense of wonder as he descended to the ground. The air was vibrant with life, singing Gaia's song as wind shook the top of trees and whistled past sharp grasses. Pollen, which Multani had never scented before, distracted him, every taste calling an instant explanation from Yawgmoth. The earth felt spongy beneath his bare, root-like feet, and he found it hard to control the urge to dig his toes down into the rich soil and taste his homeland again. Yawgmoth withheld him, waiting on the others. The elves appeared as if by magic. One instant they were absent, only the forest sound surrounded the clearing. In the next, all forest sound but the distant fall of a tree disappeared, and a dozen lithe bodies appeared at the clearing's edge. They moved into the clearing with cautious grace, as if unwilling to leave the protection of the forest. All were of fair hair and skin, with features so delicate they appeared fragile. Rain moved up to Multani's side, and the nature spirit stepped away to distance himself from her. Yawgmoth welcomes you, a female elf said in traditional greetings to Rain and the other humans. Her voice was light and musically cast. Rain smiled warmly. We are here on behalf of the Tolarian Academy to request some rare hardwoods for the crafting of your artifacts, the elf completed for her, for Urza Planeswalker. She smiled with shy amusement at Rain's apparent confusion. Yawgmoth was present for all your discussions with Multani, of course? Multani nodded his own greeting.
Long life, Shahira.
He answered, a typical elfin salutation. Yawgmoth stirring at the edge of his mind, Multani turned back to Rain.
The forest will provide you with your request for materials. Some of the hardwoods will take a few days' effort to grow.
As if to underscore his statement, the rolling creak of twisted wood resounded about them, followed by the staccato snapping of limbs being stripped away. Within the forest, only much closer this time, one of the trees toppled, then another, this one at the edge of the clearing. Multani did not bother looking, having expected the priming. 3 more trees fell in quick succession, the canopy rippling with movement. Frowning in thought, Rain studied the surrounding forest. Decay? She asked. Multani looked sharply to Rain, insulted but tempering any outward show. Surprisingly enough, though, it was Rafellos who answered first. The cycle of life, the young warrior elf said, brushing the back of his hand across the rippling grasses. Accelerated, but natural. Rain's dark eyes widened with amazement. Bending low, she examined the strange movement of the field. The grass and flowers, they're dying off and regrowing so fast they sprout from the withering shell of their former incarnation. Creates the illusion of wind. Multani had never doubted Rain's intelligence.
Decay implies failure,
He said formally.
Nothing happens here that Yawgmoth does not approve and control.
He nodded in the direction of the latest felling.
The forest is in a state of accelerated growth cycles,
He explained.
building up the forest's store of raw matter from which we may draw new strengths. Phyrexia is not the enemy of Urza Planeswalker alone.
The Tolarian artificer nodded her agreement. It's good to know we have allies, Rain said. And tell Yawgmoth we appreciate the offerings. Smiling tightly, Multani reminded himself that Rain could not be expected to learn of the forest's ways as fast as she might learn about artifice. He allowed himself a light laugh at her expense.
You should have listened more closely to Shahira, Mistress Rain.
He said.
You just told the forest yourself.
Rafellos glanced about quickly, still feeling eyes upon him. The thrill had worn off hours ago, the persistent gaze that followed his every move, crawling over his skin with a gossamer touch. His hand stayed near his sword hilt, fingers twitching as he scanned the trees and ground and sniffed the air. Danger surrounded him, stretching his nerves taut. The young elf had taken to the tree line with Multani's permission, eager to explore the land that would be his home for years, maybe decades to come. He'd rolled in leaves far different from those he'd ever seen, raced miles of near-invisible trails never before run by a Llanowar, and used some crushed berries to paint a simple hunting mask across his eyes. It was the way Llanowar claimed land, making it theirs through intimate knowledge. A warrior race, Llanowars often lived or died on the honing of their instincts. Rafellos was not about to allow his stay in Yawgmoth blunt those senses. Ambassador he might be, but first and foremost, he was a warrior. Yawgmoth, he felt certain, recognized that in him and approved. Right now, his instincts warned him of a threat. A watcher, someone dogging his tracks and a better tracker than he. Multani? Possibly. If so, the humor of the situation was now lost on the wild elf. His grin was feral, and his eyes darted among possible hiding places. Always the feeling that he merely had to turn a bit faster looked slightly harder, and the presence would resolve into the figure of his tormentor. Now came a brush at the back of his neck. Rafellos spun about, sword drawn and flashing in the high-lined attack. He checked himself a split second before slicing into the tree that stood behind him. "Who's there?" he called loudly, instantly regretting it. You never gave yourself away so easily, except this was supposed to be friendly land. Silence greeted him. Rafellos backed up a step, then another. He glanced frantically into the canopy above him and deeper into the undergrowth. Nothing. Spinning about again, he set off at the strong pace he could keep up for a day and night, half a day again if need be. He would run this presence into the ground. With every step, this disembodied gaze followed, nagging at the back of his mind.